Hello, and welcome to Red Rock Relationships, a podcast about communication. Let's unpack the relationships that we encounter in our daily lives and learn about what makes them tick. And now your host for Red Rock Relationships, Dr. James B. Stein.
Well, it's already April, which is crazy to me because it feels like we just had our first episode back in February. Alas, we are back and we are continuing our discussion on red flags. And to help us do that, we have a familiar face with us to chat a little bit about obsessive behaviors, which I believe deserved more attention than what we gave to our more general conversation on relational transgressions. So, Dr. Samantha Shebib, welcome back. Great to have you. Uh-oh. Our producer had you on. Producer had you on mute for a moment, but you're good. I assume you said glad to be here. Hopefully.
Yeah. Yes, I said happy to be here. And how are you doing?
I'm great. I've got my coffee. I had free lunch, so I'm ready to go. I'm revved up and raring to go. You ready to get into it?
Let's do it.
Nice. So, you've been on the show obviously a couple of times now, and along the way, we spent a lot of time talking about dark side stuff, right? Especially relational transgressions. We had a whole episode on relational transgressions. Now, if you go by like the most textbook understanding, one example of a relational transgression is an obsessive behavior. But I think that we throw the term around a lot. So I want to talk just a little bit about what is an obsessive behavior and what exactly makes it transgressive?
Okay, great question. So to start off, obsessive behavior is going to be something that you are doing repeatedly and consistently, right? It becomes like a pattern of behavior on your end, right? That you're consistently engaging in. And 9 times out of 10, the way we've looked at obsessive behaviors is in a very dark way. How are they dysfunctional? But we can think about actually functional obsessive behaviors as well. But in terms of why it relates to relational transgression is because of the implicit or explicit violation of a relational rule. So if you are consistently checking your partner's social media or checking like their location, the second it crosses into a violation of that implicit or explicit relational rule is when it becomes a transgression.
That's a really good point. And then, so like you said, it becomes obsessive when we develop a pattern of doing it. And I think that's the really important point because as we'll talk about, the transgressor might not always know that what they're doing is a transgression in the first place. So really quick, what are some really common examples of these obsessive behaviors? And then maybe we'll get into some of the more well-known and popular ones.
Yeah, I mean, stalking is probably like the most, known kind of obsessive behavior. And stalking can be like repeated calls to a person's cell phone, including like hangups or following a person around or showing up where the person is expected to be, sending like unwanted gifts, letters, text messages, or emails, damaging like a home or property, monitoring your phone calls or computer usage. Typically, this would be through like some form of spyware. So here, like what's really highlighted here is the obsessiveness of it, like the consistent, repeated interaction of engaging in that behavior, in addition to the fact that it's unwanted.
Right. And that's such a good, important caveat because the behaviors that you just described, I mean, they run the full gamut from, breaking and entering into someone's house or attaching malware to their computer at the extreme, obviously problematic end. But then you mentioned things like delivering unwanted gifts. And I think that this is a really important transition that we can make here because shockingly, both the literature and in pop culture, there was a documentary or two about stalkers called, I think it was called I Didn't Know I Was a Stalker. And it reinforces the idea that these transgressors don't often know that what they're doing is considered stalking. And to me, that's fascinating, right? Because, you might be like, oh, well, I'm just giving them a gift. Everybody loves gifts, right? But when you do it in an obsessive fashion, it can really put someone off. So my next question to you is from like the perspective of the actor, the stalker will say in question, like, why might those perpetrators not always understand that their behavior is unacceptable?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, this is a very convoluted question. We don't really have exactly the answers because typically when we see the self manifest, we're dealing with individuals who would be engaging in stalking. I think that it's their intention of trying to pursue somebody, and just like even in hookups and the dating culture, we're aware that there's a lot of ambiguity to the strategies that we use. And so I think that that's where it comes in line, like here, is that they're not seeing like the problems of it. And if somebody isn't explicitly turning them down or saying like, no, I do not want this, this is unwelcomed, like they don't know that they should be stopping.
No, I think that's such a good point. And it's so funny that you brought this up because I was talking about this with my nonverbal students literally yesterday when we were discussing the courtship process and how, and so how the literature is pretty clear. Men aren't especially good at picking up on passive rejection signals, right? So like, I'm trying to think of a good example. Like, a man asks a woman out and she's like, oh, that sounds nice. I don't normally give out my number, but like maybe I'll see you here again. And they hear that and they say, oh, I'll just come back to the bar every Saturday night hoping to see her there again. That's an obsessive behavior. And I think a lot of it stems from the social norm that we have where we teach men in other fields of life, but also in dating, about the importance of like not taking no for an answer, when in reality, what we should probably be doing is teaching people that it's okay to hear no and that you should be good at taking no for an answer. Where do we feel like that falls on the spectrum of obsession versus just ordinary dating behaviors?
Well, okay, you bring up a very interesting scenario because right in your scenario, when the woman communicated the message back to the male, like the woman was not actually explicitly saying no.
Right.
Right? So like there was no communication that indicated the word no. And that right off the bat is kind of the big problem. And I think as women, like, we want to be like kind, respectful. We don't want to like hurt other people's feelings sometimes. And so we have indirect ways of trying to say no. But at the end of the day, we cannot assume that somebody can read our messages for what we're sending them as if we aren't explicit regarding it. So I think right off the bat, we have to kind of say, no, like, I'm not interested, something like that, to kind of then indicate like this is unwanted and unwelcomed.
Yeah, the only issue with that is that, of course, it can be quite face-threatening to do that, especially in public. And so, yeah. I mean,
1,000%. Yeah, it's easier said than done, that's
right?
for sure. But I mean, I think like at the heart of it, and just like when we talk about, flirtation behaviors and the courtship process specifically, right? There's a lot of indirect suggestions kind of going on there that we base our responding behavior off of. And so if we are trying to be very direct regarding it, using our words would be helpful.
Yeah, sometimes you have to bite the bullet and be direct, especially if you're feeling like your safety is compromised. But I think that's a really good way of indicating when obsessive behavior might be happening, right? If you get explicit rejection, right, and you continue to pursue, now this is going to cross into a line that is more like a proper, right, a proper red flag, whereas like, oh, it was just ambiguous and I don't really know. You know what I mean? There's less wiggle room there. Speaking of drawing the line, I kind of for my next question for you here, and I want to spend a little bit of time on this one because I think there's a lot of meat on that bone. When we talk about obsessive behaviors, a lot of them have overlap with behaviors that are not inherently obsessive. For example, way back when this podcast first started, we talked about uncertainty reduction theory. And as we may remember, that theory says there's three basic ways in which you can seek information about another person. There's the interactive one where you'll walk up to them and talk to them. There's the active one where you maybe harness a third party or a mutual friend to get to know information about them. And then there's passive information seeking, which is when you just kind of like explore the world around them, sometimes without their knowing, to learn about them. The most obvious example is like stalking someone's Facebook or Instagram, right? Like viewing their social media without their knowing, that kind of stuff. So my question to you, and sorry for the ramble, but my question for you is, what's the difference between that sort of mundane, passive information seeking and actual stalking?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think, the literature on uncertainty reduction theory does articulate those three different strategies. However, more recent research that has looked at how we actually do this like online or using computer mediated communication, they developed the same three strategies, but they have an extra fourth strategy that's referred to as extractive. And so this would be like the Facebook, right? Looking at somebody else's Facebook, or even like, doing a background check on an individual, right? So using like an online forum to actually seek information regarding somebody. And right off the bat, this is where things kind of get problematic, because Facebook stalking has that word stalking in it, right? And then we all think like it's synonymous to actual physical stalking.
Right.
However, I think there's also mundane ways that people use Facebook stalking that are actually very functional and pro-social. For example, like, if you're maybe interviewing somebody and you look at their LinkedIn account, I think that's a really good use of the forum, of the platform of LinkedIn, right? Like, you're supposed to kind of do your research on individuals. If you're hiring a nanny and doing a background check, that's a very useful way to gain information that you couldn't otherwise gain if you didn't, go online and actually look at that. However, I think where Facebook stalking can kind of become actual stalking is like the repeated repetitiveness of it and the constant oversight surveillance of the activity. So you can think about somebody sliding into your DMs, but when they are doing that like on a consistent basis, right, sending you stuff that's like completely just unwanted, is where you might actually like kind of kick them out of being able to send you DMs. However, it hasn't crossed the line and become actual physical stalking because they're not engaging in the unobtrusive behaviors in your physical presence.
Right.
It could manifest itself, though, very equally, right? Somebody could feel as threatened or, as obtrused, regardless of the method, if it's actual stalking or Facebook. I'm not saying one's worse or one's better than the other. I think that they all have problems, right? The obsessiveness of it is really what's characterizing it as unwanted.
Interesting. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I really like your example of the DMs, right? Where it's like, it's one thing to slide into someone's DM and be like, wow, you're looking fire today. Or I don't even know. You know what I mean? Like paying them a compliment or something like that. And there's a difference between doing that and doing it every single day and like never getting a response, right? As if they're saying like, I see what you're doing, but I'm not interested, and not explicitly stating it. The onus right there is kind of on you to not make that behavior obsessive and to maybe just give them a compliment every once in a while or something like that. I think that's a really good example. And I also think that you make a really good point about the proactive nature of it. I think, for example, if we're going to bring it back to relationships, if you meet someone and you're curious as to whether or not they are, a problematic person, right? If you're worried about your safety or, you're just doing your due diligence, that's okay, right? That act of surveillance can be helpful. But then, of course, when it becomes that pattern like you were talking about, I think that is a great place where we can draw that line. That's good. Did you have any other thoughts on that? That was a good answer.
Well, it's also kind of interesting because we don't really know who Facebook stalks us, right? Like who's just like coming to our profile, looking at what we've posted, or, just like liking our stuff. I guess you would get a notification regarding the like. However, it can be done very unobtrusively. Like you can go to somebody's Facebook without them knowing that you're going there, gain information regarding them. But it's once you start like engaging in like multiple likes, constant commenting, the DMs, I feel like that's where it kind of crosses the line. There are other social media platforms such as LinkedIn, right, where we are aware who has visited our profile. But majority of the social media sites, we are not aware. And so it is kind of harmless just to expose oneself to somebody's Facebook page a couple times. It's not like this big deal, right? Like no one would actually know.
Right.
But it's when it's crossing those lines and now the person, the target, right, is making an attribution that this is too much or this seems off or weird. It's in the eye of the target, right? That then makes those types of attributions to say this is unwanted, this is beyond norm.
Right. All right, let's shift to, we've mostly been talking about like a situation where two people might know each other or might not know each other, initial interactions perhaps, stuff like that. I want to talk a little bit more about what happens when we're in an actual relationship and we realize that obsessive behaviors are occurring. And I think the best example of this is something called helicoptering, which is often talked about in parent-child relationships. Like I'm sure we've all heard the term helicopter parent, but this sort of behavior can happen in close relationships too, as you alluded to earlier when you were talking about things like constantly monitoring somebody's phone and checking in with them obsessively. I know that like in some high control relationships, one partner will force the other to constantly share their location with them, right? And so there's obvious trust issues here. My question is, why do we think people engage in those sorts of high monitor helicoptering behaviors? And what are some of the potential consequences or outcomes of those behaviors?
Yeah, I mean, it's control, right? At the end of the day, it's a way to control the other individual, to see what they're doing, to see where they're at, to potentially manipulate the situation, or whatever it might be. At the heart of it, it's about controlling the other person and having all access to every piece of information they would need to reduce their uncertainty or to make them feel confident or whatever the outcome might be. In a parent-child relationship, it's very interesting. I have published research related to helicopter parenting. And prototypically, when we talk about helicopter parenting, we think about it in very negative ways, and it does have negative ramifications. However, I would urge that there are some situations where helicopter parenting is completely warranted. Right? I mean, if your child's gone down the wrong kind of path and you're trying to get them right on path, like sometimes you actually do need to control. Like, I mean, they're a child. They don't know everything that they're supposed to be doing. And through trust is where you kind of like give up some sense of control sometimes. So I think sometimes there's situations where helicopter parenting is warranted. If we think about even like the addict type of relationships, and that can, not just be like a family unit, but this could also be in the relational unit as well, where like there might need to be some more controlling manifestations of a partner's behavior before you're feeling the trust again to, let this person do whatever it is that they might need to do. I mean, I would say at the heart of it is just the control, right? It's somebody wanting to control it for positive or negative outcomes is kind of doesn't really matter. It's the fact that it's happening is where it becomes like a problem. So, in my research where I've looked at emerging adult children, which would be like 18 to 29, and their perceptions of helicopter parenting on behalf of their parents, it's a perception-based construct, meaning that I can perceive my parents to be a helicopter parent. That doesn't actually mean when it comes down to that day, doesn't actually mean they're engaging in helicopter parenting. It just means that I find it more obsessive and more excessive than the norm.
Right. And then that comes down to things like, comparison groups and reference groups and the various, social judgments that we make in something like, for example, an equitable romantic relationship. I think the behavior becomes a little bit more egregious, right? Because like you said, aptly, I might add, parents kind of have to monitor their children, especially during that stage where children are negotiating their autonomy. If you're talking about two adults in a relationship and one is like making them share their location or constantly checking in or, demanding access to their phone and private information, to me, this is a little bit more problematic, and it's indicative, like you said, of some of those more,
sure.
those controlling tendencies, which we're going to want to avoid in a significant other.
Yeah. And I mean, I think at the heart of it too, helicopter parenting, the way that we used it is obviously the parent-child, but it's also developmentally inappropriate behaviors. So it's not just an excess, right? It is something that is just not okay to kind of do at that child's age, right? So for example, like calling your child's professors, like the fact that they have professors means that they're in college, that is just like developmentally inappropriate behavior. Professors can't talk to parents unless they've signed certain releases and stuff like that because of FERPA violations and everything. And also, like, your child's now an adult. They might be 17 when they've started college, but the vast majority are at the minimum 18 years old.
Right.
And so like they need to start learning it themselves. And what we found is that children then develop a sense of resiliency, right? And that is like a very big outcome that is extremely important to the well-being of us physically, physiologically, and socially, is being able to overcome hurdles and obstacles as they're presented in life to us. We're all going to have our challenges, but whether or not we're going to be resilient is whether or not we've learned how to adapt when other obstacles have challenged us in the past. So if we take somebody's ability to overcome those obstacles away from them, we inhibit their ability to become resilient. And that's extremely problematic.
That's such a good point. Damn. We have time for our bonus question, which is great, but only a little bit of time. And it's about hyperintimacy. Hyperintimacy is an obsessive behavior, and it's one that really doesn't get talked about a lot. One, because it's difficult to quantify, and two, because stalking and helicoptering and stuff like that, so much sexier. You know what I mean? But can we just briefly
It's more like a forbidden fruit than sexy.
Yeah. So just briefly, what is hyperintimacy, and how, if at all, can we distinguish it from something like love bombing, which we talked about earlier in the season?
Yeah, so hyperintimacy is just characterized as like excessive intimacy. And I think a lot of times people automatically off the bat kind of are like, but that's my love language. Touch, right? Intimacy. However, love languages has never been like factually
I want to do a whole episode on that. I really do. I'm so tired of it. I really am.
Yeah, you'll have to get Dr. Rachel Vanderbilt here to talk about it with you, because she's so passionate about it. I'm very passionate about it too, because I mean, at the end of the day, it's a pop culture thing that has then influenced a lot of people to think that these are the only ways we communicate love, and that's just not true. But I will leave that discussion for your next podcast on love languages. So I feel like we have this way of like attributing it to us that, that's just how I communicate love. So even though it's hyper and it's, excess, it's still okay. Well, I mean, it depends, right? It's a classic it depends situation, because it's the balance of both people's wants, needs, and desires in an interaction. And that might be seen as too much for the other person. And so once it is seen as too much is where it gets into that hyper intimacy. Hyper intimacy is typically studied in the context of relationships that have at least agreed to be a relationship, where I feel like love bombing typically is at the start of more narcissistic relationships, where the narcissistic individual is the one that love bombs them to like draw them in. And yes, they could be in a relationship, but it's really used at the start before relationships like set in stone.
Okay, yeah, we talked about with Dr. Tara how love bombing is often malicious in intent, whereas hyperintimacy might be a little bit more related to, like, I don't know, insecurity or like, mundane, desires for connection and an inability to like properly express that desire. So what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong here, what I'm hearing is that those two things are distinct in so much as love bombing is a little bit more premeditated and perhaps a little bit more of a red flag.
Yes, I would say so too. And I think like the hyper intimacy too can come about from attachment styles. If you think about anxious ambivalent attachment styles, where the parents are typically, they're not constant, like they're not consistently there for the child's needs, and then sometimes show up more than the child needs them to, that I could see some fluctuations of intimacy based off of that attachment.
It's more theoretical, and that's a great note to end on. So, Dr. Shebib, as always, right? As always, thank you so much for joining the show. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're actually going to extend this conversation in a couple of weeks when we talk to Dr. Robbie Hall about boundary crossing. But until then, it's been a great time. I'm excited to have this conversation, and we got some real cool stuff in the second half of this season. So stay tuned, because we're going to talk about it all.
You've been listening to Red Rock Relationships, a podcast about communication. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time. If you'd like to be on the show or have questions for us, please send us an email to redrockrelationships@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Just search Red Rock Relationships. Thank you again. And remember, it all begins with good communication.